For a very long time, the world has been run by powerful people who see themselves as superior to others. To feed their narcissism and ego, they branded certain people as slaves who were treated like property and forced to do hard labor without receiving anything in return. Fortunately, modern-day society frowns upon the practice of keeping slaves, but that doesn't just erase the fact that some thriving economies in the world today were built on the backs of these slaves. The United States is one of the world's largest suppliers of cotton, and this thriving business was built off the backs of African slaves. These people were forcefully taken from their home countries and dragged to a completely unfamiliar world where they were bought by people who owned cotton plantations. Even though these people were taking care of their master's business, their masters put them through hellish circumstances. Welcome to the Told You Another Story channel. In today's video, we'll be talking about the daily life of an African slave on the cotton plantations. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Western world was in its developmental phase. A lot of industries were being implemented, and ultimately, the labor market struggled to meet the demands of these businesses. Not only were the laborers scarce, but they were also expensive to acquire, and this led white business owners to search for cheap labor elsewhere. This search led to the beginning of slavery, and this continued for almost 4 centuries. Along with economic growth, the business of slave trade was thriving as well. Slave traders would travel on ships to Africa, especially West Africa, where they captured people from their homes, tied them up in chains, and took them aboard the slave ships. These ships were the most unconducive places to stay. Once they were on board, the slaves were stripped and marked before they were taken to the lower deck, which served as their room during the trip to the U.S. Each ship had the capacity for about 600 slaves, but the slave traders pushed the limits without considering the well-being of those aboard. The slaves were chained together to maximize space and to prevent the audacious ones from attempting to throw themselves into the ocean. The slaves were also victims of torture, as some crew members just hit them for no reason. Because of the unsanitary conditions of the ship, 1 in 5 slaves fell sick. These people weren't separated from the healthy ones, and those with compromised immunity ended up dying. But this wasn't still as bad as it got. Many others died from suffocation or self-inflicted injuries. The crew members did not deem it fit to give these people proper burials and ended up hauling dead bodies off the ship into the ocean. It was so bad that other ships passing by named the slave ships floating graves. The problem of dying slaves was addressed by the American government, which made it mandatory for doctors to be aboard the slave ships. Also, a law was passed that made it compulsory for the ships not to carry more slaves than each ship could accommodate. This led to a significant reduction in the amount of slave deaths. However, the fact remained that life on the ship did not prepare them for the horrible life waiting for them in America. When they arrived in America, the slaves were given shabby clothes and were taken to a room where they were thoroughly assessed before they were assigned price tags. Many of them were valued at as low as $200, and all of them were taken to an auction room where rich people bid for these human beings as if they were properties, and sadly, that wasn't so far from the truth. Every slave automatically became the property of whoever paid for them. The slaves were not allowed to own properties or receive any level of education, but were expected to be at the beck and call of their owners. They were not paid any salary or wages, their food was rationed, and their bosses monitored their movement. The slave buyers had different things in mind for each slave they bought. Some slaves were intended to serve as domestic workers, while some were used on their bosses' farmlands, and a majority of the slaves were acquired by cotton producers. Cotton is the most predominant clothing material in many people's closets, mainly because of how comfortable it is to wear and how cheap it is to acquire compared to other alternatives like linen and silk. However, this high demand for cotton didn't just start in our days. Sometime in the 18th century, demand for cotton was significantly higher than what the producers were used to, and in order to maximize supply, African slaves paid the ultimate price. However, before then, cotton production was not very profitable. Part of the process of cotton production was for the fibers to be separated from the seed, and this process took not just a lot of time, but it also demanded a lot of manpower. Each slave spent 10 hours separating the seeds from just 1 pound of cotton. Regardless of how much the cotton producers pushed their slaves, each slave was able to separate only 2 pounds of cotton per day. This problem resulted in an increase in the number of slaves, but the problem wasn't exactly solved until a certain man came up with a great idea. In 1792, a man named Eli Whitney arrived in Georgia. where he was hired to be a private tutor on the cotton plantation of one of the prominent members of society. While grooming the slaves, he noticed that the process of seed separation cost the plantation owners a whole lot of money. To counter this problem, he started working on a cotton ginnery prototype, a machine that was used to quickly and easily separate seeds from the fiber. The slaves could process 50 pounds of cotton in 10 hours using the machine. This invention led to a revolution in the business of cotton production, and the plantation owners finally started to make a profit. However, they were greedy and were willing to do anything to meet the ever-growing demand, even if it was at the expense of the slaves. The number of slaves in cotton production increased from 700,000 to over 3 million in the space of just a few decades. You would think the increase in the number of slaves would mean less work for each one of them, but it had the opposite effect. More slaves meant the cotton producers could expand their cotton business, as there were more slaves to take on more work. They were on the fields from sunrise to sunset, running on barely any food under the hot summer sun. The slave owners did not care about the living conditions of the slaves, who were constantly being pushed to the limits of their bodies. Many fell sick, others died, and more slaves were hired to replace those who dropped. The number of slaves only kept increasing, corresponding to the increase in profit their masters enjoyed. The most wicked part of all of this was that these people didn't get a share in the profit, which was built on their blood, sweat, and tears. To say they were treated poorly would be an understatement, and those that dared rebel were used as a lesson to others. They were stripped, flogged, raped, and given all sorts of painful punishments. For fear of what would happen to them if they fell out of line, other slaves tried their hardest not to incur the wrath of their masters. They endured the harsh treatment and worked in the cotton fields and the ginnery without complaining. They worked very long hours with barely any breaks. They had no days off or weekends, and could work for as long as 20 hours each day. Some masters even demanded that their slaves spend the whole night on the cotton plantation. The quarters assigned to the slaves weren't conducive either. While some were given poorly furnished houses in the corner of their masters' mansions, others were just given building materials to construct shabby structures for them to lay their heads at night. In their free time, the slaves were also consumed by personal responsibilities that they had not been able to attend to. Some of these include mending their huts, fixing their worn-out clothes and shoes, and planting food crops for them to feed themselves and other family members. This was no way for anyone to live, but unfortunately this was the reality of those people until the act of slavery was finally abolished in the 1960s. While the African slaves put their efforts into improving the economy of a foreign country, their home countries barely recorded any economic growth in these years. Many African countries still haven't recovered from the effects of slavery on their economy, and may not be decades, if not centuries, until they finally do. Thank you for watching. Hit us up in the comments section and give us a thumbs up if you liked the video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos.